I was born and raised on the Lower West Side of Buffalo, New York, to a Puerto Rican mother and an Italian immigrant father. My life and upbringing was a true West Side story. Being a multicultural child, my identity was always something I struggled with. My name was strongly Italian, however, my neighborhood and upbringing was predominantly Puerto Rican. I sometimes felt I wasn't Puerto Rican enough. At times I felt caught between two cultural identities, even though I grew up mostly Puerto Rican. And that always made me question, what does it even mean to be Boricua? To answer this question, I wanted to take a look into our history, our culture, and our identity.
Sé muy bien como yo soy, así fui, así moriré.
The timeless surf pounds this Caribbean shoreline of what Christopher Columbus dubbed El Puerto Rico, the rich port, when he discovered it on his second voyage westward in 1493. For centuries, ships of the seven seas have crossed the bar under the ramparts of El Morro Fortress, mightiest of Puerto Rico's many historic forts. Guardians of this one-time Spanish-ruled island, which was ceded to the United States of America at the close of the Spanish-American War in 1898.
The United States had a very long relationship with the Caribbean, including Puerto Rico, and this goes back to the beginning of the Republic. Thomas Jefferson, for example, wanted to have relations with Haiti because it was a matter of trade. However, the United States was not an imperial power outside of the scope of continental North America. We all know about the gradual movement to the west. Well, that ends when expansion reaches the Pacific, and at that point we see a burst of interest in expanding the U.S. empire, if you will, outside of the continent. So the United States was not really in the business of building empires as we know them. They did create, and this goes back to even the 1840s, what is referred to as an informal empire. An informal empire means that you don't have to have a physical, military, or administrative presence. What it means is that even though Spain or some other power owns Puerto Rico or Cuba or another colony, yet the United States economy is the one that is dictating the pace of the economies of those places. Keep in mind that Spain is very far away. The United States is much closer to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, Cuba produce tropical staples that were not produced in large numbers in the United States. So that creates an intimacy going back to, again, 1820s and perhaps even earlier than that. So why change that? Why engage in what the Europeans have been doing for centuries? That is, going to war, taking over territories, colonizing them, sending a military presence, when you are basically getting all of the advantages of the economic relations. Well, if we pursue that line of thinking, that is the economy of the United States behind that imperial surge, we must look at the intermittent depressions that happened in the United States during the last couple of decades of the 19th century. Now, a depression meant that the United States was producing far more. I mean, that's the origins of a depression. You're producing far more than can reach the markets. So the solution is, why don't we find new markets? Markets that will allow us to get rid of that surplus production and have the economy move forward. Now, Cuba was much larger than Puerto Rico in terms of size, and it had a little bit more than twice the population of Puerto Rico. So the main market was Cuba. Puerto Rico also developed some very intimate ties exporting sugar to the United States and importing manufactured goods. The other force behind this and the participation of the United States in this war in 1898 has to do with a humanitarian impulse. What was happening in Cuba, which was at war with Spain going back to 1868, was atrocious. Few people know that the first concentration camps were established in Cuba by the Spanish. So there was that push. There was also an interest in what was called the civilizing mission, that is, take democracy to these islands, bring Protestant Christianity to those islands. And then there were strategic reasons why that region was so important. So why Puerto Rico? As I said before, the United States in general, the various sectors, were in favor of keeping things the way they were. Just like in the United States today, even though not everybody's fully comfortable with the status of Puerto Rico, it is sort of the accepted, it is the default. It has become the default. So what happens was that there was a provocation. That's the way it was seen in the United States, with the sinking of the main U.S. battleship in the harbor of Havana. Studies that came later point to the fact that it was an internal explosion, that it was not sabotage. But in any event, at that time, the call was remember the Maine, and a desire to avenge that. And of course, there were already tensions between Spain and the United States. So that provokes the war. All of those factors that I mentioned earlier come into play. And here we are at war with Spain beginning in April of 1898. Now, was Puerto Rico in the plans? I've studied this period and studied U.S., Latin America, and Caribbean relations, and I have not seen an interest expressed in any place about annexing Puerto Rico. It just happened. It doesn't sound like a great explanation to come from a historian, but it was a matter of, well, we're already at this war. Spain is our enemy. Spain holds on to Puerto Rico. We might as well take over Puerto Rico. And it's interesting that even though the motivation was Cuba, and of course we know that in the Pacific, the Philippines would also become a theater of war. But what's interesting is, why did the United States let Cuba go in 1902? Although it was a letting go that had many strings attached. We can talk about that. Yet Puerto Rico was kept as a colony. And all these years later, and Puerto Rico is still a colony. It is referred to as the world's oldest colony. And there is an almost universal consensus on the island that the current status is not working. It may have worked in the past when Puerto Rico received and actually gained, I should say, many forms of autonomous rule. But over the last 15 years, what we see is that is shrinking. And therefore, the Puerto Rico that had a high degree of self-rule is now becoming more obvious that power is very limited.
siembra así, mira, se siembra hasta por aquí, la tierra lo cubre y eso vuelve a nacer. Estas cañas son las que nosotros usábamos para, ya tú sabes, para sazonar el café. ¿Ves? Bueno, aquí tenemos una pruebita, ¿verdad? Se no te me quedé velando, papá.
Estaba escuchando la historia.
Por los cabañaverales en Puerto Rico, yo me pasaba corriendo los caballos de mi papá, porque cuando el caballo, tú sabes que los cañaverales son largos, son acres y acres y acres y acres de caña, y tienen su pasillo. Acá hay caña y acá hay caña. En esos pasillos yo me pasaba calmando a los caballos, dándole una pela. La pela era cogiendo duro para que ellos botaran la energía que necesitaban botar, para entonces mi papá poderlos entrenar, porque mi papá tenía caballos de paso fino. Y los entrenaba en esos pasillos, con una rienda acá y una rienda acá, con sus amigos, para que para que no se fueran al trote y aguantaran el paso. Esa es mi historia, papá. Yo en Cañavelares fue donde me crié.
Operation Bootstrap moves forward, and today Puerto Rico is an integral part of the American economic system, a new frontier for business enterprise.
Operation Bootstrap is a combination of programs that were put in place after World War II. We talked about an earlier phase of industrialization in which the government had to come up with the money and invest, build factories. Now, after the war, the strategy changes. For one thing, what they do to those factories is that they sell them to private investors, and some of them are still standing. So there's a new stage, which is very complex. I would say that Operation Bootstrap is more of a way of looking at the world than just a set of programs. One of the things that happens is Puerto Rico enters another stage, and that means we need to bring capital from the United States, particularly, so that we can, for good, industrialize the country. Industrialize it, which of course has some positive aspects to it. Industrialization did bring some positive aspects, but it also brought some social dislocations. For example, communities were sort of broken down, and people were moving from the interior to the areas where the factories were. And that brought certain dislocations. Now you may be living in a subdivision which has sturdier homes than in the countryside. You may be enjoying a higher standard of living, but something has been lost in the process. And that is your community has sort of dispersed. And that brings other issues. The pace of life now is different. Yes, the Partido Popular Democrático managed to bring down dramatically the rate of infectious and parasitic diseases. But at the same time, you see that there's a growth in heart disease, in hypertension. There's a growth in cancer. So it's a mixed bag of changes.
We certainly are proud of what we have done, but we are not satisfied. There is much yet to do, economically, socially, educationally, politically. This is one of our chief tenets, that the economy is the servant of the spirit and not the spirit, the servant of the economy. That's what I've called Operation Serenity. We feel that as the economy reaches certain levels, a greater amount of the wealth, not only of the income of the government, but of the income of the economy as a whole, of the people as a whole, should be diverted to higher uses, to better education, to the arts, to scientific institutions, to museums, to the spiritual goods that mankind must have.
How quick was this change? That is a very important question. And it allows me to talk about the industrialization miracle. Puerto Rico, of course, was not the first country to become industrialized. This had started even in the 1700s in Great Britain, in England in particular, and in France. This is an old story. But remember that in those countries, and a century later in the United States, industrialization took over a century. In Puerto Rico, we're talking about a dramatic transformation in a matter of about 20 years. That is unseen anywhere else. What does that mean? Well, it means that maybe your father was an illiterate peasant, and now the child or the children of those parents now live in a development, now have access not just to finishing high school, but some of them have access to the university, and you see a dramatic transformation and social mobility. Let's take life expectancy. Life expectancy in 1940 was 40 years of life. Life expectancy in 1970, 70 years of life. You can only explain that by this massive program or combination of programs to bring Puerto Rico out of misery, to industrialize it, and to urbanize it. It's fascinating. What took many, many decades elsewhere happened in Puerto Rico in just a matter of 20 years or so.
You know, it took a while from the 1940s all the way to the 1970s when you saw kind of like the outcomes of that operation coming to place, right? But in the meantime, there was a lot of economic issues going on the island. There was a lot of poverty, so a lot of people decided to actually navigate the world and go out to the Northeast, and particularly New York City, which provided a lot of opportunities, right? The United States became a magnet for a lot of people to come out here, and there was plenty of opportunities because the United States became a world leader. Europe was destroyed, manufacturing was going on. There were plenty of opportunities out here. So while it took a while for Puerto Rico to sort of create that manufacturing industries, while they waited for those to come into fruition, a lot of people decided to come to the United States. But change from a mostly agricultural system to an industrial system, and that created the conditions where a lot of people left the islands to look for industrial jobs in particularly in the Northeast United States. So that great, you can call it migration or movement of the 1940s, where a lot of Puerto Ricans out of the situation, the economic situation that was going on in the island, departed the island and came to the continental United States, particularly the Midwest and Northeast states, places like New York and Chicago, to look for a job and to start families and to have a better economic future.
I am not a big fan of Luis Muñoz Marin's party. Many people are not. But if you step back and you study the history, you look at where Puerto Rico was in the 1930s, in 1940, and what it became. I don't want to give the impression that this was just Luis Muñoz Marin. I want to give credit to many people who were experts and really loved Puerto Rico and did their part in this struggle. It was not just Luis Muñoz Marin who engineered this miracle. It was people like Rafael Picó, a geographer and planner. It was people like Carlos Chardon. It was people like Teodoro Moscoso. It was a brain trust of people who were knowledgeable and dedicated. This is a sharp contrast with Puerto Rican politicians today. There's no comparison. These were individuals who gave themselves. They could have made much more money doing something else in the private sector, but they, hand in hand with Muñoz Marín, pushed the island forward.
You know, we have to understand that the world was a little bit different, right? We're coming off of World War II, sort of a fear of communism, all those type of things. Opportunities were created. The United States becomes sort of the great leader of the world. And that attracted a lot of people to benefit from that.
Muñoz Marín has his critics, and there's a book that came out just a few years ago with the title of The War Against All Puerto Ricans, and presents Muñoz Marín in a very negative light. But I think it's not a fair representation. He did take part in the suppression of some pro-independence leaders, including Albizu Campos. But when we look at the whole picture, and you look at Puerto Rico before, Puerto Rico after, Luis Muñoz Marín was able to have wonderful, respectful relations with U.S. presidents. I've seen footage of Kennedy visiting Puerto Rico and sharing with Muñoz Marín, and Kennedy's not up here and Muñoz Marín here. No, they treat each other as equals. That's a big contrast. And that also speaks to his ability to demand respect for the people of Puerto Rico. And he was not, at this point, pro-independence. The other thing that is important to keep in mind is that the idea of a new modern Puerto Rico, Muñoz Marín understood that this is creating dislocations. This is creating dislocations because of people being moved. It's creating alienation. It is creating some newer problems. Drugs begin sort of to peak in the early 1960s. That's when they begin to push forward or push up on the island. And he says it's not just important to be industrial and urban. It's important to be serene. What an idea. What a fresh idea. At the same time that we're fighting against infectious diseases, at the same time that we're building roads, at the same time that we're expanding the University of Puerto Rico, we, and schools all over the island, we need to make sure that we feed the spirit of the Puerto Rican. And that means let's have institutions such as the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture. Let's have programs that take film and documentaries to the countryside. Let's have a Pablo Casals festival when we invite the best musicians from the world, this tiny island, engaging at that high level of culture in the world. I think that's one of his biggest legacies. He saw that it was important to feed people, but he also believed that it was important to feed the spirit and take care of cultural aspects. Luis Muñoz Marín wrote his memoirs, which were published back in the 1980s, and he talks about all of this process. But there's one segment of that book that really caught my attention. And it speaks to a man later in life writing about his accomplishments, although he does it in a humble way. But then there's a phrase, I have created bourgeoisie, but I am alone with peasants. He misses the peasants. They're no longer there. He has helped create a modern, urban, industrialized Puerto Rico. So where are those peasants? If you travel from San Juan to Ponce through the expressway, you will see that up there, somewhere in the middle, there's a statue of the Puerto Rican jíbaro, the Puerto Rican peasant. It is a sign that they're no longer with us. We're memorializing them with a monument in the middle of the island.
A lot of Puerto Ricans know of their culture as something trivial and something bomba y plena kind of tied to Christmas, a festive time, and it's so much deeper than that. It literally is tied to historical contents of Puerto Rico. It literally came to be. Our musical genres and our musical traditions came to be as Puerto Ricans came to be. It came from Africa. We had some European influence. We had some Haitian influence with the Creole and French. We had connections with the Dominican. So it came to be to what Puerto Rico is as we are as a people. So I think understanding that. So bomba itself, it's super immersive and it teaches you that history. There's no just putting on a skirt and grabbing a maraca and playing around. You literally have to come in with reverence and respect and know the elements are African traditions. There's recent studies that are talking about the Taínos too and their alliance with the Africans, the cimarrones that escaped. So el bate is an indigenous word and it's in bomba. And it makes you think like, why is that? You know what I mean? So there was alliance of resistance. We weren't just sitting and welcoming the conquerors. There was traces of their alliances. So it literally is our genetic makeup, this music, and it's history.
My name is Melanie Maldonado Diaz, which is my full genealogical name. My birth name is Melanie Maldonado because I was born and raised in Chicago. I'm third generation Boricua and Diaspora. All four of my grandparents met out in the States, in the Diaspora. And I conduct research about Puerto Rican culture, different aspects about Puerto Rican culture. I'm primarily focused on Afro-descendant cultural traditions, specifically music and dance, and especially bomba. I also conduct a significant amount of genealogy. I use that as a tool to study bomba, but I also work with many other families who are not involved with bomba. Early in the pandemic, I began deviating using genealogy almost exclusively for bomba research to look at other artists, other cultural workers who were involved in promoting Puerto Rican culture through their work, whether it was through their day job or just their passion work. And out of that came a project called the Africa Habla Me series that looked at how cultural workers were manifesting elements of their ancestors in the work that they do every day. So it's been a very rewarding process, and not just for me, but helping these people connect and see that maybe some of the things they thought were unique to their own experience weren't. From their own names to some of the ways that they dedicated their lives to promoting Puerto Rican culture through their different artistic disciplines. So many folks were able to see how some of that ancestral memory had surfaced over the course of their lives, through their work, and was very much alive and present in the way they manifested themselves as Boricuas, as Afrodescendientes in Diaspora or on the island. So it's been meaningful. And in a global circumstance for the African diaspora in which there is very little recorded or archival evidence of that history for us and those herstories, this work has really been difficult because the archive is lacking, because there is little, or there are few resources to assist with that work. We've relied heavily on oral history. We have supplemented that with archival work. We've also used information captured in songs, in bomba songs, in traditional songs. We've used short stories. We've used just all manner of tools to try to excavate this information and piece together this history and these herstories for these folks and for Puerto Rico and for our Puerto Rican community, so that we are more whole by better understanding more of who we are.
I think my art are the color of my soul. They are coming from my inside. Sometimes I don't have nothing in my head what I want to paint today. But something will come. For example, I was inspiring the Quixote over there. At the same time, I put it like the Taino symbols over there. All those things you can find like in the ceramic from the Taino, in the cave. And I put over here originals. It's very, very hidden. But you can see the O, the R, the I, the G, the I, N, A, O. You know, it's trying to put something that the people go into the. It's something like maybe in the future somebody will find it. I never say that, but it's there, you see? It's like I am original. It's inspiring Don Quixote in love. In the book, Don Quixote was crazy. He lost the mind, but here is in peace. It's in love. You know? At the same time, I put it like the town, everybody together. You see, it's the unity that I wish for every town, every community. It's different inspiration. That one is the Taino. It's our root. It's inspiring the Taino too. I put over here the 1492, the year that Columbus arrived, and everything. You know what happened. But I try to do different things. Here is a mixed media. You can see they have acrylic, aerosol, oil. I don't put limitation when I try to do something. If I put limitation, pierdo la creatividad, no? And this one is the unity too. It's united like a good family. It's, for example, is I fall down, or you are next to me to support me. The same thing, I wish the unity for every race, every community, every town, every country, no matter what the colors of the race. And this is the inspiration here. If you can see everybody it's like in our country, if you make coffee, your neighbor know that you make coffee because you are too close. Sometimes in this country, in the United States, your neighbor, you say hi to the neighbor for 10 years, he never say hi. It's different in our country and this one. And this is my impression. Hace mucho. Aquí están los happy fish. I like to paint fish. Es como cuando uno tiene una pecera, te relaja. Ver los peces nada más en movimiento.
My art is kind of like a carnival. When you go to the carnival, you see so many things. They're different in their own nature, but when you put it together, they work together like a song. So sometimes I wake up and I feel that I want to work on the dolls, but sometimes I gravitate to the painting, and I love to paint in wood because that reminds me of the nature that we have in our culture and from Puerto Rico. It is difficult for me not to put all the colors of our island, all the blues and reds, even though I try to go with the pastels and be a little bit more sophisticated, like they said, it is on my nature, it is on my blood, and I enjoy it so much when I paint or when I do these patterns of color.
Mi nombre es Pedro Cruz, soy un artista visual, llevo muchos años, tengo 82 y a los 15 empecé a pintar, así que he pintado bastantes cuadros ya. Y he estado dándole más énfasis ahora a lo que se conoce como realismo mágico. El realismo mágico no es otra cosa que una especie de surrealismo. Surrealismo tiene que ver con los sueños y cosas así, pero el realismo mágico tiene que ver con cosas realistas que están en un setting que no corresponde, que es irreal, que es surreal, no es real. Por ejemplo, esa mujer está tomando té, yo le llamo al cuadro Madame Butterfly, pero ella está tomando su té y está con un fondo que puede ser más realista y ella está pintada de una forma más realista, pero ¿qué rayos hacen esas mariposas ahí? Esas mariposas lo convierten en realismo mágico. Por ejemplo, eso empezó con pintores y escultores y escritores, especialmente suramericanos. Uno de los mejores ejemplos de eso es García Márquez, con sus famosas novelas. Pues eso es el realismo mágico, es como le llaman, magical realism. Esta parte se llama el Jardín de las Mariposas. Y en el Jardín de las Mariposas cabe cualquier cosa. Cuando tú estás en un jardín lleno de flores y hay mariposas y lo que sea, pero hay muchas cosas. Tú buscas, hay una mujer encinta, hay caras de mujeres, hay caras de un gato, hay muchas cosas que puedes encontrarte en un sitio que es real, pero que se supone que no estén esas cosas ahí, pero sí están en el realismo mágico. Esto no es otra cosa que la misma cosa, pero condensada. Los cuadros pequeños. El arte para mí significa mucho. Ya te digo, desde que tenía 15 años, yo empecé a pintar y las primeras obras que hice las hice en óleo con unos pinceles viejos que me regaló y una pintura casi seca que me regaló un artista famoso que había en Puerto Rico. Yo estuve un tiempo ayudándole a él en los talleres de él y cuando ya yo me iba para mi casa, después como de un mes con él allí, él me regaló esa caja donde habían esos pinceles y esas brochas casi secas. Y yo no sabía porque yo era muy joven, tenía apenas 15 años y no sabía mucho de cómo cuidar todas esas cosas, y resulta que esa caja de pintura pertenecía a su papá, que había sido pintor y ya había muerto hacía muchos años. Y ahí en realidad yo cogí mucha influencia de los pintores puertorriqueños, especialmente de Rafael Ríos Rey, de Augusto Marín y de José Oliver. Esos tres pintores puertorriqueños influenciaron mucho en mi arte. Después, pues yo he ido estudié en la universidad, arte, estudié arte comercial también. Todas esas cosas, pues, se van a ver. Si tú las sabes, las vas a encontrar dentro de mi trabajo. Después yo con calma te puedo enseñar algunas. Y tú verás que esos estilos están metidos allá adentro. Porque eso se queda. Lo que pasa es que uno trata de hacerlo de uno. Es como el cantante que no puede cantar igual que los otros, tiene que hacer la canción de él para entonces él poderla expresar de una manera distinta.
First of all, that Ladino music, it's a culture. It's part of a culture. It's part of a heritage. And in this case, Ladino in itself, the word Ladino refers to a language that is comprised of Spanish, Hebrew, in certain cases Portuguese, in certain cases Greek, French, Italian. And the reason why is because this is the language that was developed out of that diaspora that moved out of Spain, that Jewish Spanish diaspora that moved out of Spain and went across all of those countries, the Balkans, Greek, Italy, and as they settled down in every part of Europe, they incorporated part of the language of the place that they were settling in with Hebrew and Old Spanish, Old Castilian. And so it is very distinctive because only Jewish people from the Iberian Peninsula, they would use certain words. The Boricua Ladino Music Project is a research project. That's really what it is, a research project that is devoted to the research in itself, restoration and preservation of the Sephardic culture in the Caribbean, focused mainly in Puerto Rico, but also extended to the Hispano-American community. That's what the Ladino Music Project is. And Boricua Farad, many people ask me about that. Boricua Farad, really, it's a mix between those cultural heritages. So Borican, because that's the original Taino name for our island of Puerto Rico, and then Sfarad is the Hebrew name for Spain. So the Sfaradi, or Sfarad, or Sephardic, as many people know it, is all of those Judeo-Spanish people who came to the Caribbean and the islands, and now they are called Sephardic or Sephardim in many instances. And so that's what the project, the name of the project, that's why I came with that name. When I started researching and when I started developing this project and I wanted to tell our story, I wanted to tell my personal story because I was so amazed of understanding why we did this, why we did that, why all of these questions that I had, why do I look the way I look, like going back to wanting to put myself into a box as to, a Puerto Rican look like this. And I don't really look like the Puerto Rican, the typical Puerto Rican that people say, oh, you're a Puerto Rican, right? So all of those questions were answered when I discovered all of this part of our history. And when we talk about music, I said, well, I'm a musician. How else can I tell the story if it's not through the music? Because many of the things that I discovered through music. I discovered through lyrics. I discovered through instrumentation. For example, I incorporate the cuatro puertorriqueño into this project, and it's the main element in my project. Why? because the cuatro puertorriqueño, it has Persian, Moorish, Middle Eastern influence. It is an instrument that was completely developed out of the Persian oud. And so we see it in its construction, we see it in its story. In fact, that was the instrument that started to be used in the famous aguinaldos. And the aguinaldo, it's nothing else than an Andaluz a rhythmic pattern and melody pattern. You can still, up to today, if you see scholars who are scholars that are talking about Latino music and Sephardic music, especially in Andalusia, you will listen to them playing an aguinaldo pattern in melody, rhythmics, and everything in another instrument. And so, to me, music not only can tell a story in a broader way, but it's also easier for people to grasp it because everyone loves music, especially our culture, our Caribbean Hispanic culture. We are musicals by default. And so through music, it's easier to bring a story and to bring all of the elements together that will tell that story. That is why, and also, well, I am a musician, how else? I think that's the better way for me to tell the story, through music.
My name is Maria Ramos.
Mi nombre es José Sánchez.
And both of us, we went ahead and collaborated together as two artists to paint a large painting that we did in regards to our indigenous roots. And so Jose, he's a wonderful painter. I wanted to paint with him. And so he would come every time to my home in Orlando, and he would paint for a little while, and then he would go home. Then another couple days later, he would come back, and he would paint with me again until we finished the process.
Fue un proceso bastante fuerte. Nosotros estuvimos horas y horas pintando, buscando ideas. Nos metieron en la computadora cada rato, vamos a chequear, vamos a esto, vamos a ponerle de esto un poquito, y así fuimos logrando lo que en verdad queríamos que se viera en la pintura, porque en la pintura queríamos que se viera que había sido un solo pintor, pero a la larga habían sido dos, ¿entiendes? Y ha sido espectacular. Esta es una de las obras que maestra de nosotros, de parte mía y de María.
And how long did it take for you to complete this from beginning to end?
Como 8 meses. Estuvimos como 8 meses pintando.
Yeah, about 8 months. It took us 8 months because we took our time with
Exacto.
it. And we wanted to be sure we get every detail that had to do with the native Tainos. And so we both come up, like you said, with ideas. And so we went ahead and just, little by little, painted it. Story is, this is the Taino family. And with the Taino family, they're looking at actually the future. So they're looking into the cave, and what they're seeing is their future. And so they normally would come into the cave and they pray and they offer food and offerings to their spirits, their deities. And so
La Cueva Ventana es el nombre de lo que se ve en Puerto Rico, entonces nosotros utilizamos esa imagen mayormente para lograr esta pieza.
They're looking into the future. As you know, they say that the Taino people are extinct, but they're not extinct. Because if you have a little drop of blood, just a little drop of blood in you, you're a Taino.
No tiene excusa ni explicación. Tu caso me da mucha pena. Andariego.
Puerto Rico elects its first governor. Luis Muñoz Marin, shown with his family at their home, ends the reign of American appointed officials who have governed the island since Spain ceded it to the United States in 1899. Governor Muñoz is the founder and head of the island's dominant Popular Democratic Party. The liberal former editor assumes office as the territory takes another step along the road to American statehood.
I have my suspicions, well, I actually believe that far too much time, energy, is spent talking about the Puerto Rican status. And I say this because it has been an unsolved problem. Even before 1898, Puerto Rico was divided along the lines of these three status options.
You know, the referendums we have had plenty in Puerto Rico with different type of outcomes, usually a lot of support between the Commonwealth option and the statehood option. Obviously less support for the independence sort of movement or the independence option of it. I remain a little bit skeptical in seeing that another referendum is going to bring about any other type of change, right?
Puerto Rico is una colonia, it's a colony. It's controlled by the United States of America, the politicians. There's three elements of thinking in Puerto Rico. You got those that believe in statehood, you have those that want to leave the island the way it is, and you have independentistas. I myself still independentista. I am involved in some, in supporting that movement. I make it very clear in my publication that there's a need for Puerto Rico to be independent. Again, economic business development, self-development, self-pride. If we don't develop ourselves, nobody's going to develop us.
We are gathered here today in our nation's capital with one clear message. It's time for Puerto Rico's statehood now. It's time to fulfill the promise of democracy and grant true equality for our fellow Americans back on the island. This promise that each generation of Americans before us has kept, as state after state in this great land have been admitted to the Union as part of the rich history of our amazing republic. On November 3rd, 2020, Puerto Rico held a referendum. It was during the general election when turnout was at its very highest. The ballot language was simple: statehood, yes or no. And Puerto Rican voters, by a majority of 52.52%, voted yes.
Puerto Rico's been through a lot, particularly over the last decade or so, with a over decade-long economic recession, Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Irma. That was the deadliest natural disaster in modern American history. Nearly 3,000 Puerto Ricans on the island died. Combine that with Promesa and the budget cuts and the loss of sovereignty for their government, earthquakes, and now add in COVID. And it just shows pretty clearly that the territorial status is a failure. And the best evidence beyond that is we saw 11.3% reduction in population in this most recent 2020 census. That was by far the biggest population drop of any region of the United States. People are making their decisions with their feet, many of them coming to Central Florida. And that's what shapes us a lot. We Puerto Ricans see this firsthand because the majority of folks come from the island to the mainland here in Central Florida. Others going to New York, Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, and other areas. But we're getting the lion's share of them. So we see these refugees from natural disasters, from economic strife, folks who would rather stay on the island if they have the ability to do so. We certainly welcome each of them with open arms. They're part of the driving population increases of our state, but we don't celebrate the fact that they've felt they've had to move. And so against this backdrop, we saw the Puerto Rican legislature take their destiny in their own hands. They put a simple plebiscite on the ballot, a simple statehood yes or no question on the general election ballot. This was superior to past plebiscites in that it was a simple question. Others have been confusing to some folks, and still others have been during special elections where the turnout wasn't high. This was a simple question in a high turnout general election ballot. And I had a big part in helping craft the language and encouraging them to put the plebiscite on the ballot. And the people voted, 52.52% in favor of statehood. If they would have voted no, I wouldn't be filing the bill. But they voted yes. And in America, when we vote, when democracy is in motion, action needs to happen. And so I filed the Puerto Rico statehood Admissions Act with the resident commissioner, the person elected by the island to represent folks down there, Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, in conjunction with Governor Pedro Pierluisi. And every Democrat in Florida has signed on. A lot of the Republicans from Florida have signed on. And we have 50, almost 60 co-sponsors, including the Majority Leader, Steny Hoyer, the Dean of the House, longest serving congressional member, Don Young of Alaska, a Republican, also on the bill, along with many others.
This is how I see it. Let's say that we're looking at a couple. One member of the couple does not want to get married. And I'm using the metaphor of statehood and marriage. So one of them does not want to get married, doesn't want statehood. Let's say that the island doesn't want statehood. In fact, the island doesn't want statehood. It's never gotten over 50%, over 48, 49% of the votes as a formula. And then on the other hand, we have the other member of the couple, the United States. Now, if Puerto Rico wanted to get married through statehood, Puerto Rico could try to seduce and convince the other member of the couple, let's get married. The problem is that neither side wants that marriage. They're very happy living together in sin and not having to have that full, that long-term commitment that we need to stay married. So I don't see it as I see it as the status discussion is like, and there was a story, a short story I read many years ago about two young women in New York, and they were fantasizing about if they won the lottery, what they would do. I think there's some fantasy here in these discussions about which status is better because they haven't bought the lottery ticket.
We've seen this before in the past, and obviously in an election year, people make a lot of promises. So that will yet to be seen in terms of that. I think that maybe conditions are a little bit different, but you know, it will require a lot of change of hearts in Congress. And I know some delegation in Congress, you know, with Puerto Rican descent have actually pushed for that idea. But still, it's still a divisive issue in Puerto Rico. And I think we still need to have a conversation of what would be the implications of becoming a state, staying as we are, or you know, deciding to have another platform, maybe independence or, you know, an associated republic or some other type of a status with the United States.
You have to understand Puerto Rico has really been politically destroyed. The spirit, the political soul has been destroyed in Puerto Rico. So the movement, the independence movement is not as aggressive as it used to be. Because this country, you know, it wasn't into I think it was 54, I don't know exactly, that Puerto Rico was allowed, you know, to raise the flag publicly, to put it in the windows. At one time it was illegal to you know, be proud of your Puerto Rican flag and display it publicly. We were not allowed to do that, you know.
To me, the status of the territory is a failure. I've never been opposed to independence. There just doesn't seem to be a large enough support for it. It polls between 8 to 10% at best. Other than an at-large set of members in the legislature, they're not able to field a group of legislators. And you see the independence movement more popular on the mainland with Puerto Ricans who live in states and enjoy all those rights. And so, you know, we're going to empower the folks on the island. And our bill would set up one last binding plebiscite. Right now, it's as a statehood yes or no question, and it would be an invitation. If Puerto Rico votes yes, they would automatically be admitted with a year-long transition. Puerto Rico's government is already really well integrated into the federal government. There would just be making funding equal, making sure they have elections for 2 U.S. senators, 4 members of Congress, making sure we have all the tax issues worked out and other regulatory issues worked out, and then President Biden would admit them to the Union under the bill. We had a hearing, the first one on a straight up statehood admissions bill ever, the first on status in over 6 years. And I felt we had a strong case because, one, people know the desperation down there, and that 2 U.S. senators and 4 members of Congress would have helped, would have changed the fate after hurricanes. It would have, as a state, they wouldn't need promesa. There would be all these different things that would be setting a new path.
People talk about Hawaii and Alaska becoming states. Yes, but do you know the number or the percentage of people who favored statehood in those 2 former territories? It was around 90%. Let's say that as a big thing, 70% of Puerto Ricans want statehood. Let's just fantasize about that. Okay. What about the other 30? Are you going to have a country where 30% of the people are fervently opposed to what you have just imposed, statehood, and it is forever? Think about that. On the other hand, the United States doesn't want to push that because there's no consensus. And frankly, there's no interest among the political elites in this country whether to push for statehood. It's something that every now and then some politicians come up with another push, but honestly, I think that the discussions about the status have taken so much time and energy and effort from the people of Puerto Rico, and it hasn't panned out.
Puerto Ricans are amazing people. We're very unique. We're a small colony and a small people, but we're all over the world. We're artists, we're poets, we're architects, we're mathematicians. You could go on and on, man. We have great creators, Puerto Ricanos, you know, all over the world, in practically every country. And imagine if we could develop that political consciousness, Puerto Rican. Even in this country, if we could get there's over 2.5 million Puerto Ricans, I believe, in the United States. If we could get all these people united, develop the concept, develop the vision, a passion, you know, to help to link a pipeline to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico could be an independent country with all the wealth and support of the Puerto Ricanos here in the United States. And one of the arguments that people use in Puerto Rico is Puerto Rico es muy pobre. It's too poor. It cannot survive, you know. And that contrary, that's not true. You know, Puerto Rico has developed the resources, you know, and human resources throughout this country and throughout the world to be able to really help Puerto Rico become independent and a striving country.
What to do? I don't know. What I can tell you is that one of those 3 formulas, the autonomous formula, the Estado Libre Asociado or free associated state option, which is currently in place, that option was very attractive. To the point that some politicians back in the 1980s were repeating the slogan, "This offers the best of both worlds." So we have our autonomy, but we also have certain protections from the United States. Fast forward to the last 5-6 years, and what we're seeing is that it may actually be turning into the worst of both worlds. Because Puerto Rico is not independent, it can't make its own decisions about, say, well, you know, we want to make our own decisions about a merchant marine and trade with other countries. Puerto Rico can't do that. But then on the other hand, those protections are diminishing, and those autonomies are actually diminishing.
On the island, there's a concept called enhanced commonwealth. That is not a thing. The U.S. Supreme Court's been clear. You have, just recently, you can be a state, you could be a territory, you could be an independent nation. And if you are an independent nation, you could decide to be a freely associated state like Palau or Micronesia, or you can be on your own, totally severed from the United States. But you can't just make up things that sound good. And that really was driven home during this hearing, that the options are clear under the Constitution by our Supreme Court, that a convention would just delay those and, in fact, perhaps create options that would never happen under the Constitution. But there is a potential compromise. We are open-minded to including all three statuses, both statehood, territory, and independence, on a binding resolution. And this is something I've offered publicly already a couple times as we work through the process. We're waiting on the Biden administration to come back with their Department of Justice legal opinions on the two bills, and then expect a markup perhaps as early as later this year. But I can tell you this is a limited window of opportunity. Regardless of whether you support independence or whether you support statehood, if we don't get this done over these next 2 years, it's unlikely we're going to get it done for a while. So we're in a unique period of time where we have to seize the moment.
You know, Puerto Rican politics are sort of interesting, and sometimes we say that, you know, politics is Puerto Rico's national sport. Obviously, if you think back at sort of the structure of the parties and how they became, right? Obviously, after the Commonwealth Party, the figure of Luis Muñoz Marin that created the Commonwealth Party, or the PPD, as it's called in Puerto Rico, obviously brought a lot of loyalty from a lot of people, right? This was the governor that transformed Puerto Rico from a poverty-stricken place to an industrial place, provided housing, provided resources to a lot of people that never seen that before. So if you're loyal to that party, doesn't matter, and it tends like that loyalty is generational. Right? So it goes from family to family to family to family to generation to generation. Obviously, the other big proponent out here, and to remember that our political parties in Puerto Rico are based on the status question. So the other one, the PNP, which is a progressive party, obviously advocates for statehood, basically proposes since the 1970s, equality for Puerto Rico, that we need to be part of the union, but at the same time, contentious type of politics, contentious type of policies that kind of like run counter to what they're aiming for. And in between those two parties, obviously there's a lesser support from the independence movement, and obviously, Puerto Rico, like many other places where, we had the fear of communism, any type of, resemble to socialism, communism, or independence was met with force. And I'm not talking symbolic force, but actual force. So that basically shut down the support for an independence option out here. So we have those two main parties that been in power since the 1950s, and even with what happened with Hurricane Maria, what happened with the corruption, the financial crisis, all sort of things. It's so ingrained in the political psyche in Puerto Rico that that loyalty still is very strong.
People in Puerto Rico receive less support in terms of Medicare and Medicaid. There are certain provisions in Social Security that are not equal to those for U.S. citizens in the United States. As I mentioned earlier, one of the changes is, Puerto Rico is in debt. Well, whose fault is it? Well, I think there's plenty of blame to go around, and we should not forget that politicians on the island have been very irresponsible, criminally so, in terms of how they use the funds, how they use taxpayers' money. It is true, and they have become indebted. If you count the debt of the corporations, the public corporations and the government of Puerto Rico and the municipalities, it's over $75 billion. If you add all of the pensions that the government of Puerto Rico must pay for retired workers over the next few years, then we're talking about a debt that is over $120 billion. Now, we need to understand why that happened, and there were certain provisions hidden in a U.S. law somewhere which very few people were aware of. It was like almost like a hack of a piece of legislation in which the island was obligated, against the Constitution of Puerto Rico, was obligated to first take care of its debts, particularly to foreign U.S. lenders or investors, and then they could take care of other things. Where did that come from? So it is a responsibility of speculators who bought Puerto Rican bonds knowing that they were junk, and then they lost. Isn't that what capitalism is about? You take risks, you invest, you either win or you lose, but in this case, because of Puerto Rico's status, you actually invest with very little risk. And that is what the junta of Promesa is trying to do. We need to pay first for those outside investors who were speculators. Wait a minute. And then what happens to the Puerto Rican worker who was a teacher for over 30 years, retires, and now their pensions are at risk? They didn't bargain for that. So it's a very complicated, very ugly situation. And well, we need to figure out what happened with the money. We're talking about billions of dollars. Politicians on the island are not pushing for that because they know that both parties are responsible in the spending spree and the corruption.
So we have many states that still retain their own cultural identity. Hawaii, Alaska, New Mexico. We have many tribes within these states, like the Navajo and Hopi tribes that are bigger than most states. They retain their native languages and culture and ceremonies. And just because you're a state doesn't mean you lose your culture. Issues like language, those are decisions for the Puerto Rican legislature to decide. I would imagine they'd keep the language as Spanish. And we have here in downtown Kissimmee, you'll see Spanish billboards. In Miami, you really don't even need to learn English. And so culture remains, it endures, but it's each of our responsibilities to teach our kids and our grandkids about that culture. We have way more Puerto Ricans now living in the mainland, yet we're proud and we continue that culture in all the cities I mentioned early on in this interview, New York and Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, here in Florida and states across the nation. So maintaining culture is a deliberate, intentional thing that our culture as Boricua we have to continue to teach, whether on the island or on the mainland.
We're living in very interesting times in Puerto Rico, and it all boils down to that colonial relationship, which is almost unique between the United States and Puerto Rico. Where are the rest of the colonies? Just a few little places here and there. Even Greenland is no longer a Danish colony. But Puerto Rico remains the world's oldest colony, and it continues to suffer all of the consequences of being a colonial state.
I think that saying, yo soy boricua hasta en la luna, I think that well defines it. It doesn't matter where we are in the planet, that land will call you. Those roots will literally make you feel like you're yearning for something there. For me, I'm eternally homesick.
I know people, they call themselves Boricua, but they have no reference to the history. So it's to many of us, it's rhetoric. Because yo soy Puerto Rican, yo soy Boricua, but don't really understand what that really means in terms of our relationship with Taino Indians, with the Africans. were part of that whole combination that came together and developed the Boricua. When I say I'm Boricua, it's a historical connection, you know. Yo soy Boricua from what happened in Puerto Rico con los Taínos and the Africans and the abuse and the invasion of Spain and the violation of Spain.
Boricua to me is the sun. Boricua is the mar. Boricua is la música, la comida, the language. When I'm thinking about being Boricua, I'm thinking about my heritage, my grandmother. My grandmother, she's a Taína, okay, with the long hair. My grandfather is an Africano with the big bush, okay? And having the three races in Puerto Rico, se me salen los pelos, oh my God. It's just that word that says Boricua that brings the different cultural aspects to who I am. Like my soul thinks of music, my soul thinks of food, my soul thinks of the beach, las playas bellísimas de Puerto Rico. That smell of the ocean, that view of the mountains. In Christmas time, the jíbaro cantando.
What it means to be a Boricua to me, it means so many things. It means music, food, dancing. I grew up in the South Bronx. I believe the South Bronx is the biggest town in Puerto Rico. A lot of Puerto Ricans migrated to New York City back in the 60s, 70s. My parents were part of that movement. Both of my parents, my father's from Mayagüez, my mother's from Rio Piedras, and me and my brother were born in New York. What it means to be Boricua to a New Yorican, it's funny because we love our culture. We were born in New York, but we know we're Caribbean. We love the beach. We love our food. We love our traditions, from bomba y plena to salsa. But then there's always this conflict that Puerto Ricans from the island don't see New Yoricans as Puerto Ricans, you know. And there's always this conflict, but I don't understand that, because at the end of the day, we all eat our pernil with adobo. We all make our arroz con gandules. We love our pasteles, alcapurrias, relleno de papa. You know, whether we were born in the Bronx or in Puerto Rico, we carry that in our blood.
Misconceptions that I would like to address when defining a Puerto Rican. The first one that I would like to address is the misconception in itself, in which we were brought up to say we're just African, Spanish, and Taíno. And the reason why is because of what I mentioned before. We are so much more than that. We are a culture which has a huge diaspora all over the world, and that migration, it didn't just come up yesterday. It's been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of us just, well, our Taíno Indians, they are diaspora in itself. They came from other places and they settled in Puerto Rico. So in nature, we are a huge diaspora. So we are a mix of cultures. And something that I would like to address is the very fact of us being a mixed culture, because it gives you a sense of a broader identity. It gives us a sense of not just looking at the outside aspect of how we should be looking, how we should portray ourselves to be enough Puerto Ricans, and how people also look at ourselves, look at us as Puerto Ricans, not to put us in a box as to we should behave such and such way just because Puerto Ricans should be like this, just like this. So we are broader than what we think. Also, I think that for new generations, it is very important that we address that our culture is so rich that we can identify and identify with and be compassionate towards many cultures, because you never know. You never know. There's a saying in Puerto Rico, ¿y tu abuela dónde está? Right? And that was a saying that it was a very, it was a little bit of, how do you say, despectivo, because it was referring to our African American heritage. ¿Y tu abuela dónde está? How's your abuela's hair, right? But it's a truth. We don't know, or at least many people don't know. But for example, in my family, our family had a lot of customs, a lot of ways in which I was raised that I always ask myself, where does this come from? And nobody had an answer. Nobody, not even the history books had an answer, because that has been taken out of our history books. And I want to address that part of our history that for one reason or the other, which many of them, we could talk about that until tomorrow, have been taken out of the history books, our identity in many instances. And this one identity as a Sephardic, as a descendant of Judeo-Spanish people, as a B'nai Anusim, or a crypto-Jew descendant, has been completely wiped out of our history books. And that is something that I would like to address.
Well, to the question of what does it mean to be Boricua? And obviously there's not going to be a right or wrong answer. It's, one of the things with the Puerto Rican community is that it's not a monolithic type of community. It might mean things to different people. I think at the end of the day, Boricua means doing the best that you can. Boricua means working hard. Boricua means appreciating family, appreciating friends. Boricua means appreciating your culture. Boricua means knowing how to have a good time, but at the same time take care of the important things in life. Boricua means recognizing that we have a lot of differences, but recognizing also that we have a lot of things that brings us together. So Boricua means a lot of things for a lot of people, and I think that sometimes that label tends to unify us, and we'll continue to be Boricuas. Like the song says, yo sería borinqueño aunque naciera en la luna.
For me, to be Boricua means a lot. It means people that deserve more credit. They don't treat us like everyone else. And every day of my life, it's an honor to me to prove that Boricua is a great culture. And a lot of my friends feel the same way, that they need to prove themselves. But now that I'm older, I have learned that I don't need to prove to anyone what is being a Boricua, because there's no reason to prove it anymore. I know who my people are. We have given so much to this country, and I know it. We have served in every war that this country has been involved. And a lot of my friends have done the ultimate sacrifice. And if they want to give us credit, it's fine. If they don't, it's fine too. And I'm very proud of being Boricua. And everywhere I go, I make sure that they know I'm Boricua.
I have definitely had the experience of being told that I'm not Puerto Rican because I was born in the United States. And the person that told me that the most in my lifetime was a family member. And that was extremely painful. I was a child, and my grandfather, I have to say I have to identify who it is, would tell me, tú no eres puertorriqueña, tú eres americana, tú eres una gringa, tú naciste aquí, like you were born here and you know, you're not Puerto Rican, you were born here, you're American. Which, now that I know so much about our family history and know that at that point when he started telling me that, he had already lived so many years in the States, longer than I had even been alive. It's true. When you go to Puerto Rico, they'll still tell you that to this day. And I've learned to not let it affect me because I feel very secure in my cultural identity. And I know how I live my life. It's not just something I kind of turn on when I go to Puerto Rico. It's how I live every day. And it is, my heart, you know, it pulls me toward that work, toward that culture, toward that identity every day. So, but it's true, you go there and they'll tell you to your face, pero tú naciste aquí o tú naciste allá. And so as soon as they ask you, are you born here or you're born there? And when you admit, you know, or you clarify your place of birth, and then for them it's like a no-brainer. It's like, well, you just answered your own question. Like, of course you're not Puerto Rican. You were not born in Puerto Rico. So that becomes a kind of a national or a nationality or an identity about nation of birth. Which then gets complicated by colonialism, because then you're having this conversation with like, well, if I'm Americano, pues tú eres también. And so they don't, you know, that's not a conversation folks want to get into. Like, if I'm an American because I was born under the banner of the United States, so then you are too. Because of colonialism, you are also. So it's a complicated conversation. And I think that people who are who understand a lot of these subtleties and not so subtle aspects of our political status don't have that, don't kind of live in that binary.
Boricua, nunca lo puedo olvidar, siempre me siento puertorriqueña, pues creo que también es un gran honor porque nací en una isla que es muy bella. Y creo que la naturaleza influencia mucho al individuo. Y haber nacido en una tierra tan linda, con playas tan bellas, con un clima ideal, pues también hace que la persona sea contenta. Somos contentos los puertorriqueños, porque somos felices de haber nacido en un lugar así. Y además eso, como digo, influencia en que en una isla siempre conoces personas de otros lugares. Siempre hay gente entrando y saliendo, así es que somos sociales, somos personas que amamos a los otros y estamos en contacto con personas de todas partes del mundo en una isla, y eso me ha ayudado mucho a mí también.
The most important thing to remember is that we're Boricuas, and we have a direct link to the African American community. Because they're part of us, we're part of them. It's having an appreciation and understanding the history of why I'm Boricua, you know.
Damn, how would you describe a Boricua to someone who has never really met a Puerto Rican? That brings me back to when I was in the Army back in 1988. There was this kid, his name was Wajda, and he came from Wisconsin. And Wajda made a comment one day where he said, Puerto Rican? What's Puerto Rican? Is that a religion? And I looked at him and I said, why, yes, it is.
Un amigo, atención. Zapatara, 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 zabarabadadui. Shubap, 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 shubap. Shubap, shubap, ba. Beli, 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 beli. Quipase, quip. Pon amigo, atención. Yo te canto con amor. Pon amigo, atención. Como buen humano tengo sentimiento. Pon amigo, atención. Como soy así fui, así moriré. Pon amigo, atención. Oye mi rumba sabrosa. Pon amigo, atención. Cuando critica mis arrugas y eres mi sentimiento. Pon amigo, atención. Cada uno indica una experiencia más conteniendo. Pon amigo, atención. Si la vida yo bien sé, todo tiene su final. Pon amigo, atención. Por eso mira para adelante que no vayas a chocar. Amigo, atención. Ponme atención, yo te lo pido. Pon amigo, atención. Complacer a mi gente es mi prioridad. Pon amigo, atención. Con mi garganta en mi pecho, aquí me tiene el derecho. Mi dedicación sincera.